And take it away, Melissa.
Sounds good. Thank you, Tim. Well, hi, everybody. We're here to talk about, this is a mouthful, best practices for delivering, sharing, and discovering content in the Power BI service. If you would like a copy of the slides that I am reviewing here, or any of my other presentation materials, you can find them on my website on the presentations page, which is coatesds.com or coatesdatastrategies.com. Both of them take you to the same place. I'm Melissa Coates. I'm self-employed for about 2.5 years now. Been in the consulting world for, I don't know, a couple decades almost. And my background is, data warehousing, business intelligence, things of that nature. These days, I focus more on the Power BI side of things. And within that, specializing more in the governance and administration types of topics. So don't ask me a hard DAX question. I'm not the right person. And I spend most of my time currently doing a couple different things. One is tech writing for Microsoft. And if you have been using the Power BI adoption roadmap and or the new thing that is just now starting to be published is called Power BI implementation planning. That's where I spend a bunch of time these days. And then I've also got an online course that takes all of that same kind of stuff and into a whole nother level. So check that out if you like tonight's presentation and you are interested in more. What we're going to talk about tonight is delivering, sharing, discovering content. So what I'm going to do is split this into 3 main areas. First, we're going to talk about collaboration. And by that, I mostly mean the people that publish content and edit content, how they work together. Then we'll move into thinking more about distribution of content, so for our viewers. And then we're going to round out our discussion with a little bit of data discovery talk. And I'm going to actually formally define these 3 terms for you here in just a second. The other thing that's important to know is that we really are focusing on the Power BI service here. Report servers out of scope, so is embedding. And both of those are really important pieces of the whole puzzle, but we're focused really just on the Power BI service for this conversation. I've also got a couple of other related presentations that actually have some overlapping content. And they're both here. They're both on my presentations page. This one here, though, I'm focusing more on thinking about collaboration, thinking about distribution, right? So the one on the right here is more security focused. So although we're going to talk about security a little bit, because we kind of have to, that isn't our main focus tonight. So just wanted to point that out that if you kind of want to dive a little bit deeper, I've got a couple of other things on my website there that you might find interesting. So before we dive into collaboration, what I want to do is define 4 terms for you so that you know what I mean when I say certain things. When I say collaboration, I'm just talking about people working together. And this happens a lot in our workspaces when we're talking about the Power BI service. Certainly, though, it can happen back in Power BI desktop or in other tools that we might be using. So just a very general term. When I say distribution, I mean delivering content for others to consume. So we're really talking about those viewer-only people and how do we do that well for them. We often like to say that an app is a good way to distribute content to a large audience, but it's not the only way to distribute content. Sharing, here's where it gets trickier. We can use this term in 2 ways. In fact, I did it as part of the session title. Most of the time when I say sharing, I am literally speaking about the actual feature in the Power BI service where we say, I want to share this one report with somebody, that sort of thing. And we'll talk more about what that means. But you can think of sharing as one way to distribute content. And it also is used generally as well. When somebody says, oh yeah, I'll share that with you. Well, they might mean it literally, and they might mean something else. So just kind of something to watch out for when you're talking to somebody, because I think we've all had that moment of, oh, I thought you meant this. The fourth term, data discovery. Here we're just talking about metadata. So helping people find content that they actually don't already have access to necessarily. The whole idea around this is to encourage the reuse of data. I already told you I have a data warehousing background. So that's something fundamentally that I see as very, very important. I talked to a customer a while back who has, they said about 3,000 reports in the Power BI service. Hugely successful Power BI implementation. Guess what? They also had about 3,000 data sets. So that's where you start running into concerns and why we want to talk about the reuse of data. And we'll do that as part of the third segment of tonight's talk when we talk about discovery. Let's start with collaboration. And here we're focused mostly on workspaces and mostly on those content creator type of people. I'm going to go ahead and mute. Oh, it looks like I can't. We'll let Tim do that. Go ahead and mute somebody that's got a little noise going on. Now, fundamentally, you might think that, yeah, a workspace, it's just a place for us to store our artifacts. So artifact, just the general term for all the things that we can publish: report, dashboard, data set, data flow, the newest data mart that is not shown on here, that sort of thing. But it is more than that. The primary purpose of a workspace is to help facilitate collaboration. So here I'm showing one data model owner who's going to work with a report owner, who's going to work with somebody who is going to do testing, because of course we all do testing really well, right? And we could all get that done in a workspace. And I'm not showing dev, test, prod, or any of that kind of stuff. Just the conceptual collaboration is the primary number one purpose. The secondary purpose that we're going to get to in the next section is content distribution for small teams. And all I mean by that is we've got a few content viewers. There's a workspace viewer role. Sure, we can do that too. Works best for very small teams. And all of that will become much more clear as we talk about it in more detail. When we're talking about workspaces, what we need to do is organize them well. Now, we would be doing so by subject area, right? But before we start thinking about subject area, we can also think about, well, what kinds of things do I want to store in this workspace? Because that supports collaboration. And when we have different people who develop and maintain these different types of content, we need to structure it well so that we can set up security properly in order to facilitate that collaboration. As a practical example, here is 5 workspaces. Top left are some data flows. Top right are some other data flows that are more specific to a subject area. Bottom left is a shared data set that is going to be used among a whole bunch of different reports shown at the bottom right here. So the 2 reporting workspaces at the bottom right have different scopes and topics. They might have different people who publish these reports. They might have different change management and review or approval needs, right? And so, for instance, we might think that accounting analytics, that workspace might be much more formal than a accounting month-end closing reports sort of workspace. So things like that as we start to think about how we want to structure this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I've got a blog post that there will be a link here for it for you. Very quickly, the kinds of things we want to think about when we're planning workspaces. The big ones are the subject area, right? And how sensitive is the data? So generally speaking, separating our content by the subject area is the top thing that we want to do. We want to think about who's the content being delivered to. So for instance, the content delivery scope, which is also can be thought of as a security boundary. And so the two biggies, subject area and security boundary, are the two biggies, right? But then we start thinking about some of these other things, right? Licensing mode, license, how we want to use the app to distribute content, right? That can make you back into how you want to plan for the workspace. Content ownership and management. So here, depending on who is going to own and manage the content, they might get their own workspace to do that, right? Because you don't want to over provision and have everybody just be on the honor system that they're not going to touch each other's stuff. And then we might have to start, depending on how we deploy it, separating dev, test, prod, et cetera. Lots of other things here. There's a link at the bottom. Really, I just want to get you thinking about, oh yeah, how I structure my workspaces absolutely affects how I can collaborate with people and how I can distribute content. Most people start out with, oh, I'm going to create one workspace per team or department. And it's essentially based on your org structure. And for the really small, collaborative, informal workspaces, right? Maybe we're a small team. There's 4 of us, we work together. That might be just fine. In a lot of cases, though, you're going to outgrow that because it's just too broad and it's not practical from a long-term perspective. If you get more than a few dozen artifacts in a workspace, hard to manage. So we talked a couple minutes ago about these different types of workspaces. So this little picture here, like a data flows workspace, a data sets workspace, a reports workspace. The reason that that helps collaboration is because you know exactly who can edit content in those different workspaces. And you also know who can view the content, because it's very, very common for there to be a lot more people that can edit content down there in the reports workspaces, and a lot fewer people that are going to edit the data sets or even the data flows. So that means you can set permissions the way you really want to set them. And then here's a big bonus, because all of the people that are creating reports and publishing them down here on the 3rd tier of the workspaces, if they need row level security to take effect from this data set up here, guess what? It works, because everything isn't all in one workspace. So huge, huge benefit there if you need that to work. So when we're helping people collaborate, when we're helping them do that in a secure way, we would have a set of data authors, basically. They would get the workspace role up here where the data set resides. So here I'm just showing it in a data workspace, right? So they would get admin member or contributor as relevant, right? And then your report authors, they would get admin member contributor, but only down here on the report workspace. Up on the data set, they would only get build. Well, read and build, to be fair. So that's how we help people collaborate doing multiple types of jobs, right? Report creation versus the data model management, and do so in a secure way. When we've got a shared data set like this guy up here, or a lot of people in the community like to call it a golden data set, we're thinking about data reusability. So we've set it up where we want it, right? And then we can do lots of things with it. We can connect from reports, live connection. We can do analyze in Excel. We can even start creating a composite model that has its own layer of reports using the newfangled direct query for a Power BI data set. So the whole thing where you start down here as a live connection, you flip it to a direct query connection, and you add in other data sources, and voila, you have a composite model. So lots of things that we can do, and all of that depends on the build permission. So that build permission here on the sales data set allows you to do a whole lot of different things. There's a couple tenant settings also that have to be set up properly to allow you to do this. But fundamentally, we usually say the build permission is the key. And knowing that's going to be really important when we get down to our discovery conversation here in just a little bit. There's a few different ways we can get the build permission. And I'm mentioning this because it's really easy to hand it out to people that don't necessarily need it. So we can first just grant it directly on an actual data set. So if I go and I look at my permissions for this guy right here, and here we'll just pick, I've got a little group here. It's only assigned read right now. And I could add reshare or I could add build to that right here. So we can do that directly on a data set. And that is the most clear way to go about it. However, there's a whole bunch of other ways that we basically indirectly turn around and grant it. We can do that. Can happen when we're sharing a report, when we're publishing an app, or any of the workspace roles. So the workspace roles of contributor, member, or admin, you can already edit the content. So of course you already have build. But if we pop back over here to really just anything, if I hit share on this particular report, actually, hang on. Let me go do this a little different way. Let me just go to direct access here. And if I want to add a user, guess what? Allow recipients to build content is by default. So is a reshare. Allow recipients to reshare the report. So this is happening at the report level, but then it will be granted on the underlying data set. And really all of that is done by Microsoft to help collaboration be easier. But if people aren't paying attention to what they're doing, then you just, you get into a situation where permissions are a little bit loftier than they need to be. So really the thing that you want to do is make sure that your internal users know what those options mean and can make good decisions, the people that are allowed to directly share content and publish it for others. Now, how all these kinds of things that we just talked about, they all affect how we collaborate with multiple teams. And then if we take it up another notch, really it impacts how we go about BI in general in the org. So if we take it from thinking about, actual workspaces up to a much higher level, if we are trying to accomplish enterprise BI, well, that means the data and the reports are both owned by some sort of centralized team. And on the far left, if we're trying to accomplish business-led self-service BI, the data and the reports are owned and completely managed by a decentralized team, like maybe the accounting group. And then where it gets trickier and where the workspace tactics that we just talked about really make sense is when you're trying to use a managed self-service BI situation. Usually that's talked about where we say, oh, the data is owned by a centralized team and the reports, well, they're managed by the decentralized team, right? But here's the thing, those patterns of using a shared data set and reusing it for multiple purposes can absolutely be done by anybody. It's just a pattern. It doesn't have to be IT owns the data in order to follow this managed self-service BI pattern. From a role perspective, the three main roles that allow you to edit content, those are the ones that we say are for collaboration. And then the viewer role is really the one that's about distribution for small teams. And that's the one we're going to talk about in the next section. So really, you just want to look at who is in your workspace roles. Because, well, I remember one time I'm sitting there, I'm getting familiar with a client's new, what they've done in Power BI so far, right? And I pull up a workspace, I'm looking at the roles, and I see 50 different people that have admin permissions inside of a workspace. After I caught my breath and asked why, they don't have a good reason why. So just know that the more people that have edit permissions, the more risk that something unintended happens. And the longer you go in a Power BI implementation, certain content gets more critical and has to be carefully controlled more so. So we're not talking about limiting people. I'm all about user enablement, but let's just do it in a really responsible way. Last comment I'll make in this collaboration section is about personal workspaces. Don't store mission critical content in a workspace. Just don't. It fundamentally equates to risk because that person leaves, goes on vacation, switches jobs. It is a real hassle to reach in, go get it, republish it elsewhere. So just teaching people to use a standard workspace instead makes it so that we can inherently collaborate better anyways, security, and it reduces our risk that something really, really important is sitting in someone's personal workspace. All right. That brings us to our second section. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I will pause for just a second here just to see if anything comes up before we move on. We can take some time at the end as well to chat about whatever questions you have, which in some ways is easier once I've gotten through all three because they're also interconnected. Alex says, talking about separate workspaces for data set and reporting for users without a Power BI license, will it be sufficient for the reporting workspace to be on premium? So let me go back to a good spot for that. So let's say you've got, I'm debating which angle to answer this from first. If these workspaces are sitting on a full-fledged premium capacity, and what I mean by that, let's just make sure everybody knows what I mean by that. Every workspace has a license mode in the premium settings. So Pro, PPU, my capacity isn't running right now, or embedded. If they're sitting in a full capacity, so that's the big one. You buy a P1 or a P2 or a P3. Those are usually at least, say, $5,000 US a month, retail anyways. Then the people that are just viewers of these reports can have a free license. If the workspaces are sitting in Pro, then kind of everybody's going to need a Pro license. If they're sitting in PPU, everybody also needs a PPU license. So the rule is if it's created on a PPU workspace, everything downstream from it also needs a premium per user license. So the only way you get by with free users is if they're viewer only and it's sitting on a full-fledged premium capacity. Hopefully that covered that. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about distributing content just a bit. So here I'm talking about apps sharing workspaces. That's one of the most common things that is just kind of confusing for people about, well, which one do I use in which situation? So that's really the main objective for this section is to bring a little bit of clarity around that. So when we're talking about distributing content, we're really predominantly focusing on those content viewers. And that means I've got multiple choices. I've got the two kinds of workspaces. And when we are using a standard workspace, you see everything in the workspace when you've got that workspace viewer role. Okay. When we're using an app, we are looking at a collection of content. And then when we are referring to sharing, we're looking at one piece of content. So over here, right, if you have a role to see this workspace, you get to view everything in this workspace with your viewer role. Now, there might be row level security happening too, but still, you see everything. If we're using an app, you see the items that we have elected to include in the app. And we'll talk more here in a second about some of that, but it's still a collection of things. Both the workspace and the app are a collection of things. So that's where sharing can start to become helpful, is because sharing is always on an individual item level. But guess what? That comes with the trade-off of it's on an individual item level, meaning that it's tedious, right? So the way I see it, the primary purpose for each workspaces, you've already heard me say this, team collaboration, small team distribution. Apps, that's where we're talking more broad content distribution. And sharing is where we just want to distribute one individual thing. So if you're finding yourself sharing a whole bunch of different things in a workspace, you're creating so much work for yourself. All right, so let's talk through each one of those three just a little bit more. That was kind of your tour of where I'm heading, almost the Cliff Notes version, if you will. So when we're talking about distributing content in the workspace, it's easy, right? So if you've got a small team, us 4 people that work together, we don't need an app and we don't need anything fancy. This is fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using a workspace viewer role for, let's say it's your boss who doesn't need to edit content. We'll just give them a workspace viewer role, right? Assuming there's not a lot of junk in there. If there's a lot of junk in there, then maybe an app would be nice to filter out the junk. So that's what we would do with this yes, no, is we would filter out the things that are not worthy of including in the app. But think of the app as more of a packaged up set of related content. So it's a nicer way to distribute content. And it's also because each workspace gets one app. It's also another reason why workspace planning is a pretty important activity. I'm sure you've all seen a Power BI app. So if not, let me know in the chat and I'll pop over to the service and we'll look at it a little bit more deeply. But really the big deal here is that we've got the nice menu and the navigation over on the left. And we've got things like we can do links. So for instance, here's a link to a web page with a glossary. Or maybe there's a template that I want to distribute as part of the app, which doesn't always work, by the way. That is making a big assumption that the same people that want to view the app as a content consumer are the same people that want to build new content with a template. And so I wouldn't necessarily do this a lot, but I would definitely do it before allowing people to do the save a copy of a report. That we usually don't want people to do. And usually the reason for that is because the content's branded. So let's say it's produced by such and such team. Maybe it's certified, maybe it's validated, maybe you've got a nice logo in your footer that indicates that sort of thing. As soon as you let people start making a copy of it, the value of that has degraded. Now we saw that little yes, no toggle, right? So let's say the workspace has 3 reports, the app has 2 reports. Here's the deal. It's always published together. Not only the content, but the app permissions. So if I go to update app for this handy dandy workspace, and I go to my permissions page, I have allowed a group called sales access to this app. And they're always collectively deployed together. So guess what? That means if you've got content in the workspace that is a moving target, it's not ready to be published, but you need to add somebody to the app, guess what? You're in trouble. Now, the biggest thing that you can do in that regard is to use groups for the app permissions. Then you're not republishing the app just to add a person, right? That's the easiest way to get around it. The next thing that happens is that you start looking into dev, test, prod kind of situations with separation of workspaces. And then you can start using deployment pipelines if you want to as well. But the biggest thing I want you to know is that they're both published together. The other thing I want you to know is that they're really not as decoupled as you think. So some people kind of almost lightly use the workspace as dev or test and the app as production. And for something like a report, that works fine because the report changes don't take effect to people viewing the app until it's been republished. So that part's nice. Collaboration's happening in the workspace. Then the real distribution is happening in the app. Here's the problem with that. And another reason why you might outgrow using an app as a lightweight prod.
Melissa?
And that's because anytime you affect the data set, those changes take effect immediately. And that's perfect when we're talking about, say, data refresh. Not so good if we are adjusting the model, updating calculations, changing relationships. We can quite literally break a report in the app because we're mucking around with the data set in the workspace. So be very, very careful with that. They're not totally decoupled, particularly for the data layer itself.
Melissa?
Yes.
Do you want to take a question now, or do you want to hold off on questions?
Yeah, I spotted it there, and since it's not, it's kind of while we're paused, let's do it. Since it's to the prior section, I thought we'd handle it when we pause, but I do have it in front of me, so I'll grab them for sure. If it gets really noisy as far as chatter, I'll rely on you to pull them out for me. If it stays quiet enough, I can handle it. But so Ronaldo says, how would IT handle in an organized manner the support calls when there are several or quite a few small shared workspaces, not personal, not apps? And here's the thing that some people do. And in fact, let me go back to this to help me explain. What approach a lot of people do is that if the business published the content, the business supports the content, because it's not always something that IT can support something that they did not publish themselves. Gets trickier when we're in the middle column, of course. So I think the first thing you got to do is figure out specifically what's the responsibility of the content owner that published the report or the data set or whatever type of artifact it is, and is support part of it. Now, when we talk about certified content, which isn't something that we're going to talk about a lot in this session, but it's really important if we are encouraging data reuse, right? That we make sure that it's accurate and validated and all sorts of things, right? Supported is one of them. So you would have the set of criteria for in order for something to, for instance, be certified. And it's easy to use that one, right? Because it's a physical thing we go do, as opposed to anybody who can publish to a workspace that they have permission to. The other thing that you might look at, if I pop back over to the Power BI adoption roadmap that we were discussing just a little bit before we got started, one of the sections of it talks about user support. And we go through and we talk about these 6 levels of support. And this might give you some ideas, but it starts out from being very informal, peer-to-peer support, and even internal community support, a forum, right? Somebody says, this isn't working. Has anybody seen this, right? Even though that's a very informal thing, it's phenomenally important to the success of helping the whole user community when you've got a lot of self-service authors, right? And then we start getting into, for instance, like you said, the help desk. And what are they capable of doing versus they might need to ask for extended support and that sort of thing. So this page, I put the link in the chat for you, might give you a few ideas, but I agree it's not a simple problem to solve if somebody who didn't create the content is responsible for supporting it. Let me give you my rule of thumb to start with for how you would use a workspace versus an app. And if this is the mental model that you start with, then you can kind of adjust from there. Initially, ideally, workspaces are limited to just the people who are doing authoring, development, data validations. In other words, people doing collaboration. And we limit access to the app to just the read-only consumers. Now, we've already talked earlier about an exception where, yeah, it's fine to have workspace viewers for, the casual, informal, small teams, all that sort of thing. But this is a really good rule of thumb to start from and then say, in this situation, I'm going to twist that knob just a little bit and handle it a smidge differently. Now, we've talked a bit about workspaces. We've talked a bit about apps. Here's the tricky one, sharing. We have 2 kinds of sharing. And as a reminder, this is the thing we do on one individual item, right? Like a report. We've had direct access for a long time. The links are fairly new. They've been GA for generally available for, I don't think it's been a year, but they're definitely newer. The links are now the default though. And there are 3 different ways that you can use these links. And let me show you what I mean by that, because this is really tricky and really important. Now, this share icon is the first thing you see here in the workspace. So guess how much people overuse sharing that are kind of new to Power BI and aren't necessarily familiar with all of the different options that we have, when to use a workspace, when to use an app, etc. So sharing becomes overused a lot for that purpose. Now, if I click that share button, the very first thing that pops up is people in your organization with the link can view and share. You know what that really means? That means everyone in your organization. So that's something you want to turn off in the tenant settings. So if I go over here to another user, so here I'm on tab number 2, which has got purple. I'm logged in as a different user. Here, if I do a share, guess what? She's not in the group in the tenant setting that's allowed to do this, right? So her default is specific people. So it's one of the best things that you can do to help reduce the risk of how content is distributed is to turn off. In fact, let me just show you where to find that. In just a moment to pop this over. In the middle of the wide array of export and sharing settings, there is a allow shareable links to grant access to everyone in your organization. On Twitter today, I had a little bit of a, not a rant, But I did a thread. A couple people were talking about it on Twitter, and I said, I have thoughts. Let me jump in and talk about them. So this is something that I have it limited to just very few people that are allowed to share to the entire organization. So anyway, these sharing links then, if I choose specific people, for instance, here's the reshare that is on by default. The build that we talked about earlier is not on by default. So if I were to say apply, now it's going to ask me for which specific people would be able to view and share. But don't be fooled if I start over again real quick. Even if you keep this first one selected and you put in things here, that's just who gets notified. That is not setting it for specific people. That is setting it for the entire organization. So one of those things that I personally think is a little overly permissive in terms of how the defaults work. But nonetheless, if we go, what I want to do is for this report, I want to go look at the permissions. Here's a couple of existing links that are already created. One of them is for read and build, and the other one is read. You can see this one user can access both, and this other user can only access one. Each one of these literally is just a link you can hand somebody to go view the report. So here, this user, her name is Sadie. Here's the tricky thing to know about these sharing links. See how the first one, they both have read, right? The first one has read and build. So you can think of the first one as being more elevated than the second one that's only read. Because of that, Sadie, this user here, if she got sent this link down here that's a read-only link, it would still work for her because she has access to another link that allows read and build. So that's a way, it's a little bit counterintuitive at first because you would think they're kind of exclusive to the lists, but they almost inherit just a little bit there. So watch out for that. There's also direct access sharing. Here we see the people that are basically inherited from the workspace roles. And then, you know, I could add somebody if I needed to. So anyway, those are our two kinds of sharing. And here's the thing, the best way that we can use sharing are informal scenarios. I want my boss to see this thing, and I might even be sharing out of my own personal workspace for this purpose. It's just a preliminary analysis that I want them to see. That's an okay thing to do out of my personal workspace. If I pop back over here, come on. All right, well, here it comes. I have a bad example of a report that is Southeast Sales Division monthly totals. If we were to look at the permissions for this, the entire sales and marketing department out of my workspace, not a good idea. All right, so it's also tedious because it's every single report or every single dashboard. So when you want to use sharing, you really do want to provide read-only access to just one report or just one dashboard because you don't want them to see everything in the workspace or you don't want them to see everything in the app. And the way I want you to think about sharing is that it's an exception to the workspace roles. And if you start to think about it, it really is. So if you're really good about managing and looking at the workspace roles, but you're not paying very much attention to the sharing for individual items, definitely do, because I think of them as an exception to the workspace roles. on an individual item basis. So depending on your audience, if you have a large team or you need to distribute content broadly to a lot of people, for instance, the entire sales organization of sales reps and sales managers in our global organization, that sort of thing, that's where an app is a perfect solution. Small teams, either Workspace or an app, whichever. Here we're talking about small informal collaboration and viewing usually. So I'm not as worried. It's the larger, more formal, broad distribution where I'm much more worried about let's do it smoothly. And if we are needing to work with just certain individuals, sharing can be a valid option. So to put what I just said in a slightly different way, how I would like for you to think about it as your rule of thumb, and then just adjust accordingly, is when you need to distribute content to viewers, your first choice is to use an app. It's the best user experience, right? With that menu, with extra links, that sort of thing. Second, Workspace Viewer. And it's only in second place because it's still that collection of objects. We can manage security in one place for everything in the workspace. Third choice is the links or the direct access sharing. So it's third place just because it's maintained for every item. So it absolutely has a place. This next thing, we've already talked about it. It's just a decision tree. What type of content do you have? If it's sort of official or formal, use an app. If it's collaborative and they can see everything in a workspace, use the Workspace Viewer role. And if it's one thing, use sharing. Again, third choice, not first choice. That is something that people that are newer to Power BI end up overusing sharing. All right. Discovering content is our last piece that we want to talk about. And here what we're thinking about is, I'm a content creator. I want to find some data that already exists. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. Fundamentally, how do we know that data exists? We saw this earlier, and how there's a whole bunch of stuff we can do with a shared data set. But how do we know that that data set already exists is the crux of the problem. Take it even further. Maybe I have 3 data sets and one of them is used by a whole bunch of reports, right? Maybe it's really useful to see that, oh, there's a lot of reports dependent on this data set. That's the one. That's the really important data set, that sort of thing. How people usually approach this is, first, they're just going to ask somebody. We're going to go ask Joe, where do we find that sales data that we need? But that assumes you know who to ask. And that also assumes that the person is willing to share the information with you, which of course they should be, but we're all humans and these things happen. Then we think, okay, I'm going to do a search in Power BI, right? There's a nice search up at the top. Guess what? You have to already have permission to the thing for it to come back in search. So that's great. It's secure, but it doesn't help us find that data set that does sales data already exist, so I don't have to reinvent the wheel. So level 3 is actual data discovery, that we see the existence of an artifact, even if we don't have access to it. The level 4 that we're not going to talk about is a full-fledged data catalog, and that's outside of Power BI, and that would be something like Microsoft Purview. And so we won't talk about that now, but that would be something that takes it to another level where you start registering all sorts of data artifacts, things from databases, in addition to Power BI, things from your data lakes, etc. You just heard me say search is based on existing user permissions. Discovery is more about, I can see the metadata and I can see that this thing exists. And in Power BI, there's 2 big things that we need for this to work. One is endorsement, So it's set to be certified or promoted. And 2, it's set as discoverable. And I'm going to show you this in a second. Let me just get through these last couple of slides so that we can leave those behind. There's a thing called the Data Hub. It used to be called the Data Sets Hub, and now it's just called the Data Hub. And with the introduction of data marts last week at the Build conference, those now can be set to be discoverable as well. But we're just going to stay with the tried and true data sets. So let's say there are 3 different data sets across 3 different workspaces, and you kind of, knowing that you can use search, but it relies on your permissions. How do I see in one place all the data sets that exist? And that's the whole point of the Data Hub. So what I'm going to show you here in a second is how to accomplish something like this, where this first one is certified and it's set to be discoverable. So it'll show up for somebody who doesn't already have permission. Something like this is certified, but it's not set as discoverable. And then something like this third one is neither. And the key to making all of this work is, well, let me come back to this. Let me show you something, and then I'll be able to articulate that a little bit better. So let's go over to the Data Hub, the newly renamed. At the moment, what this is picking up are data sets and data marts, and I don't have a data mart created in this tenant yet. I need to get to that, but this is my user that has created a whole bunch of stuff. So this user I'm logged in as Peyton, and Peyton can see all sorts of stuff here. If we look at the properties for my favorite sales data set, there's a couple things happening here. One is that it is set to be certified. And the other one, the other thing to know, if I make this a little bigger for you, is that it is set to be discoverable. So we set that on a per data set basis. The other thing to know is that although we can certify and promote, but we can endorse other kinds of artifacts, reports, dashboards. We can't make those discoverable. The current form of this, and I don't know if it's going to change, right? But the current form of this, the Data Hub encompasses the data layer only. All right, so if I go to another window, so here I'm logged in as Griffin. Griffin has, if I look at his workspace list, he has no permission anywhere to that sales data workspace. And he has no permission at all to the sales data set. But we just saw in the settings a second ago that it's set to be discoverable. So guess what? As he peruses his Data Hub, see this guy here is grayed out. Even the owner is hidden, which is interesting. Must be a privacy thing that they're complying with. And so the one thing that pops up here is a thing that says request access to work with this data. And then I've got this nice little message pop up. So if I go back over to my other window where I'm logged in as Peyton, and we go down here to the request access property, here are some custom instructions. So essentially for this one, pretend that we want to send people to a web page. And that, so we tell them, hey, here's where to go to. We let them know ahead of time, you'll be asked for a brief justification. The manager of the Center of Excellence is going to approve it, and we're going to access audit every 6 months, that kind of thing. Now, if I go to another window where I'm logged on as yet another user, now I'm logged in as Scotty. Scotty has read access to this data set already. So notice that it's not grayed out, and he does indeed see the owner. But guess what he does still see? He still sees the request access to work with this data. That's because he only has read access. He does not yet have build access. So if we click that, it goes here. If there's not that special message, it just creates the standard little request access workflow that's built into Power BI. So that request access workflow, it's targeting you asking for the build permission on the data layer and shoot, lost that second part. It'll come to me if it's important. All right, so that's the big three things that I wanted to talk about: collaboration, distribution, discovery. With the time that we have left, we can tackle any questions that you have.
Melissa, that was fantastic. You covered so much material that I knew a little bit of each. It was really thorough and kind of filled in a lot of gaps.
Well, thank you.
Any questions? Don't be shy. All right. Melissa, is there any other resources that you think is really valuable, or additional information that people should go check out besides the links that you've presented?
Yeah, I've got some links on the screen. I've got in the chat earlier, there's the Power BI adoption roadmap, which is certainly more strategic. But if you're really trying to roll out Power BI, even if you're not the executive sponsor or the decision maker, this kind of stuff is all really important to know. And then kind of pay attention to this stuff that we are going to be publishing here over on the Power BI implementation planning side of things, because it's going to be so helpful. And I'm wildly excited to see that get built out over the next few months.
Fantastic.
Hello, can I ask a question? This is Juan.
Yes, go right ahead.
Awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, and perhaps I missed this since I was not at the start of the presentation, but I wanted to ask the presenter, how did she came about using VI as her main tool in her career?
Oh, well, I had an accounting degree. So I started out my professional career in the accounting world. So I got bored doing the same thing every month, every quarter. So I figured out, I turned into an Excel jockey. I had figured out things like how to import my journal entries to the accounting system. So I just kind of turned into the proverbial power user and built access databases and got in trouble for those queries that I would send to a source system, because back then I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I was just pointing and clicking. And then somebody at the time in the IT department, this was back when I worked at Washington University in St. Louis, and they had a job opening for a web focus BI developer. And they said, Melissa, we think you would be great. And I didn't know a darn thing about web focus. I said, well, okay. And so within the most interesting part about that whole story, though, is that had to be within a month of with that new job, already learning a bunch of stuff, they came to me and they said, Melissa, we need one of those data warehouse things. We're going to send you to a Kimball class. Thank goodness I got start off on a decent foot. We gave me SQL Server 2005 was just coming out. And so, we started building Cognos reports, SSIS packages in the data warehouse and SQL Server. And then just, slowly over time, I focused more on Microsoft. And then over time, I focused more on just the Power BI side. I think you all can probably feel the pain of there's so much to learn and know and keep track of. So if you try to be a general data platform specialist. It's not even a specialist anymore, right? The Azure Data Platform, for instance, is massive. So, we all have to settle for knowing a little bit about a lot of stuff and more about certain things. So where I ended up where I am now.
Fantastic. All right.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Hi, Melissa. Nice presentation. Wonderful. I'm happy to see that we haven't implemented few of the things that you mentioned. Just because reading, we didn't know if we are doing right. I think we're doing right. We had to implement some of the other hints that you have been providing. Those are useful. The question for you is the question that I receive mostly. Who got access to what? Do we have a way to pull a central repository or a document that we can pull out that say, those are the workspaces and this person have access. These are the other workspaces and this person have access. Because as you add, remove, then you kind of lost track of who is doing what.
Yes. So here's where you need to start diving into the REST APIs and collectively, in fact, let me actually find the post instead of the API page, metadata scanning. So collectively, they call some various APIs, they call them the scanner APIs. And it takes a little bit of knowledge to figure out how the heck to start using these things. So set aside a day because you're going to need it. But essentially what you can pull with this is two things. One is what I usually call a workspace inventory. So, if I have these workspaces, it has 40 reports and 3 data sets, right? Just an inventory of what's there. And that inventory can also include what all of the roles are that are assigned. So the members, contributors, et cetera, of the workspace. So that can be part of your inventory. So I tend to talk about it from the workspace inventory perspective and then a workspace security perspective. Both would be considered snapshots at a point in time. So there's that. I'll pop this into the chat for you. And then what you would combine that with is just the general Power BI activity log. So that's more about what happened. I get down to the list of items. Here we go. Here's the reference list of the operations that are available. So if somebody shared something, for instance, that would be logged. That sort of thing. And generally speaking, when you take that inventory snapshot, with the security and combine it with the actual activity that happened, that gives you the full picture. And then the other thing that you can do, if I go back to the REST API reference, there's also an API if you're looking more at a person. So what does this person have access to? There is, what's it called? Not GitHub users. Ports users. Get user artifact access as admin. So this would be, I need to know everything that Bob has access to and that sort of thing. These sorts of things, though, you got to be a Power BI administrator to run the things that are considered an admin API. So essentially, these are the set of APIs where the admin of the Power BI tenant can see metadata across the entire tenant.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I have a place to start.
Yep. The other thing, if we pop over to the current release plan, what used to be on the release plan is something that they're calling admin insights, which is a set of built-in data extraction and data reports for the activity log piece. So wouldn't be the scanner API piece, at least that I know of, just the activity log, because the effort that you need to get up and running is kind of a lot, right? They know that. What is unfortunate, if we go to the change history for the current release plan and we go down to Power BI, that's features added, features removed. Admin insights with centralized metadata and built-in reports has been removed from the current release plan. So we know that we're not going to have a public preview before October. But I mention it because we know it's coming and it'll be a much easier starting point, but it's still months away. So I've stopped telling people to wait for it because it keeps getting pushed farther out, but it will be easier at some point to have better overall admin information across the whole tenant.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right. Any other questions from Melissa? Fantastic. Melissa, I want to thank you so much for presenting today. I mean, it was incredible material. I'm going to go back and watch the video again just to absorb it all. Quite a bit there. One of the things I want to remind everybody, our next meeting will be on July 6th with Ginger Grant, and she'll be speaking on the topic of DAX. She's an excellent speaker and presenter, so I hope that you all get a chance to join us on July 6th at 5:30 p.m. And maybe Melissa, if she's just before she goes to bed, she'll pop in and join us for a little bit. I think
could be.
I think you'll enjoy it here. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording for a moment.